The candles in the great dining hall of Tiverton had been burning for 3 hours when the man the household knew as Mr. Aldous Crane rose from his seat at the far end of the table and set something on the white cloth in front of him. It was a small thing, a ring, heavy and plain. The gold darkened at the shank as old gold goes when it has been worn a long time against skin. The crest on its flat face was the Vane device, a hawk in flight above a broken chain, and every person in that room who had known the late Lord Vane recognized it in the same breath that they recognized the hand which held it. Miss Clara Pemberton was seated near the middle of the table, between Mrs. Dorrit and the solicitor, Mr. Crod. Josiah Clement, who had arrived from Shrewsbury that afternoon without explanation and had been very quiet through the soup and the fish, she watched the ring land on the cloth. She watched the faces of the tenants and the neighboring gentry register what they were seeing. And she felt, in the base of her throat, the slow resolution of something that had been coiled there for 2 months without a name. Nathaniel at the head of the table had gone the color of unrisen dough. What happened next she would revisit in memory many times. In the weeks that followed, always beginning at the same point, the moment when Mr. Blink Crane, or the man she had known as Mr. Crane, lifted his eyes from the ring and met hers across the length of the table, and the expression on his face was not triumph. It was exhaustion. The particular exhaustion of a man who has carried a thing a very long way and has only now set it down. She had known him for 6 weeks. She had not known him at all. Tiverton Hall stood in a fold of Shropshire hills above the Severn Valley, and it had been Clara's home in every practical sense since the age of 4, when her father Robert Pemberton had taken up the post of estate steward to the old lord of Tiverton. She had grown up in the steward's cottage at the edge of the home wood, had learned to read in the great library, had played in the kitchen gardens with the tenant children, and later, when she was old enough to be useful, had sat at her father's elbow while he worked the accounts. She had loved the old lord honestly, and without calculation, the way a child loves a man who treats her with consistent kindness in a world that offers nothing consistent. Her father had died 3 years ago, in the winter of 1816, shortly after the old lord himself. He had died discredited. The new lord's papers, meaning Nathaniel, who had inherited in January of that year, had described a shortfall in the estate accounts of some £430, and the shortfall had been laid to Robert Pemberton's negligence, which was a word that in this context meant theft, and was understood to mean it. Clara had held the letter in her cold hands in the cottage where she had grown up, and read it 3 times without being able to make it mean what it said. Her father had kept those accounts for 19 years without a single error. Nathaniel's own lawyers had been able to identify she had said so. She had been heard with the particular polite patience that is extended to women who are grieving and wrong, and then she had been thanked for her long service to the family, and offered a position as companion to Sophie, Nathaniel's ward, from his first marriage. She had accepted. She had nowhere else to go, and Sophie was 8 years old, and had already lost her mother, and did not deserve to lose the person who read to her before bed as well. So Clara had stayed. She had stayed through Nathaniel's second marriage to Cecily Harbrook, a woman of good family and excellent dress sense who was not unkind to Clara precisely, but who regarded her with the faint impatience of someone who has inherited a piece of furniture they did not choose. She had stayed through the remodeling of the East Wing, through 2 seasons of poor harvest, through Sophie's bout of scarlet fever in the summer of 1817. She had stayed, and she had kept the accounts in the same ledger her father had used, correcting the errors that appeared in the columns when Mr. Falcourt, the new steward, who was Nathaniel's man and not an especially careful one, worked too quickly. She did this without drawing attention to it. She did not think she could prove her father's innocence. She did what she could do, which was to make sure that the pattern of negligence was not repeated, and she placed what she found and corrected into a second, private ledger that she kept locked in her writing case. She had not been looking for allies. It had not occurred to her that allies might arrive on the mail coach from Shrewsbury on a wet Tuesday in late October. Mr. Aldous Crane arrived at 3:30, when Clara was overseeing Sophie's geography lesson in the schoolroom at the top of the house. She heard the carriage, which was not unusual. She heard Mrs. Dorrit's voice in the hall below, which was also not unusual. She did not go down. Lord Vane had engaged a tutor for Sophie through a correspondence agency, having decided at Lady Vane's suggestion that French and Italian and a little Latin might improve the girl's prospects, and Clara had not been consulted and had not expected to be. She had been in the middle of explaining the course of the Loire when Sophie abandoned her map and ran to the window. "He has trunks," Sophie said. "Only 2, though Papa has 6 when he travels." "Your father travels to London," Clara said. "Tutors travel lighter." Sophie considered this with the equitable gravity she brought to most things. "Is it because they are poor?" "It is because they are practical," Clara said, and brought her back to the Loire. She met him at supper that evening. He was already seated when she came in with Sophie, standing at once in the way that men do when the habit has been drilled early and cannot be entirely suppressed by changes in circumstance. He was taller than she had expected from the size of the trunks. Dark-haired, lean in the face, with a quality of stillness about him that was not shyness. It was the stillness of a man who has learned to take account of a room before committing to his presence in it. His eyes, when he looked at her, were hazel green and watchful, and they lingered for one beat longer than a first introduction usually required. "Miss Pemberton," he said. His voice was quiet and level. "I have heard you are indispensable to the household." It was an odd opening for a tutor. She filed it without comment. "Miss Sophie is an excellent pupil," she said. "I hope you will find her so." He looked at Sophie. Something passed briefly across his face, something she could not name because she did not yet know what she was looking for. Sophie held out her hand with her best drawing-room gravity, and he shook it with complete seriousness, and Sophie approved of him at once, which Clara noted because Sophie was not a sentimental child and did not approve of people easily. Over the following weeks, Mr. Crane settled into the household with a quietness that was almost seamless. He took his lessons with Sophie in the mornings and was given the use of the library in the afternoons. He was courteous to the servants in the particular way that speaks of long familiarity with household systems rather than deliberate condescension. He ate with the upper household at supper opposite Clara, and was sparing with his opinions on everything except books and the behavior of starlings in autumn. He asked no questions about the estate that could be called pointed. And yet Clara noticed things. She noticed that when he walked the grounds with Sophie on fine afternoons, he did not take the paths a new arrival would take. He took the back paths, the ones that ran behind the home wood and along the kitchen garden wall, paths that were not on the estate map she had seen him given on his second day. She noticed that he knew, without being told, that the old pump at the north end of the stable yard was prone to freezing, because she saw him direct one of the grooms to lag the pipe before the first frost, in a tone that was not advisory but certain. She noticed that he paused sometimes in the doorway of the library with his hand on the doorframe, in the attitude of a man who is measuring a room against a memory of it. She noticed that when Mr. Falcourt, the steward, mentioned at supper one evening that the South Meadow lease had been renegotiated at a lower rate, something shifted briefly in Mr. Crane's face. Not surprise. Something colder than surprise. She did not know what she was noticing. She began to pay close attention. If you have stayed with this story even this far, you understand already that Clara Pemberton was not a woman who permitted herself the luxury of conclusions she could not support. Leave a thought in the quiet corner of your attention, where the questions that matter tend to wait. The library at Tiverton was a long room with 3 south-facing windows and shelves from floor to ceiling on the east and west walls, and Clara had had the use of it since childhood on the informal understanding that she did not disturb the arrangement of things. She went there on a Wednesday afternoon in early November, needing to check a reference in a county history for Sophie's next geography lesson, and found Mr. Crane at the central table with the estate records. This was unusual. The estate records were kept in Mr. Falcourt's office, not the library. The volumes on the table were older ones, from the previous decade, and he had them open at the accounts for 1814 and 1815. She stopped in the doorway. He did not hear her. He was bent over the columns with the focus of someone who is not reading but verifying. A finger moving slowly across a row of figures, and his face, in the winter afternoon light, carried an expression she recognized without being able to place it. That particular mixture of grief and anger that belongs to a person who is finding in the numbers something they already suspected but had hoped was wrong. She must have made a sound, because he looked up. The silence between them lasted perhaps 4 seconds. Long enough for him to see that she had seen. Long enough for her to watch him make a decision. "You are looking at my father's accounts," she said. Her voice came out steady, which surprised her. He did not correct the designation. "Not your father's," he said after a moment. "Or not only. These are the years before your father had full charge of the columns. The discrepancy begins in 1814. He paused. "I believe it was introduced, not accumulated." She came into the room then. She set her county history down on the nearest chair and walked to the table and looked at the columns he was looking at, and what she saw confirmed what her own corrected figures had been saying in the private ledger for 2 years. The shortfall had not grown. It had appeared, suddenly fully formed, in a single quarter of 1815. And the entries that created it were in a hand she had always known was not her father's. "Who are you?" she said. She asked it quietly, standing beside him at the table looking at the columns rather than his face. Because that was easier. She was not afraid of the answer. Precisely. She was afraid of what it might cost them both. He was quiet for a long moment. "My name is Edmund Vane," he said. "My father was the old Lord of Tiverton. My brother Nathaniel holds this estate on the strength of a codicil added to my father's will, that I believe to be forged." He paused again, the way he paused before things that were difficult to say without some care. I returned to confirm it. The afternoon light lay in long bars across the account books. Somewhere in the house, Sophie was practicing her scales on the pianoforte, the same passage repeated patiently 4 times, and then a 5th. "My father," Clara said, "was accused of causing that shortfall." "I know," Edmund said. He looked at her then, directly, without deflection. "I know what Nathaniel said of him, and I know it is not true. That is part of what I came to demonstrate." She studied his face for a moment. In the methodical way she studied columns looking for errors. She did not find any. She found the weariness again, and beneath the weariness something that had been kept on a tight rein for a long time, and was only now, in this room, relaxing the smallest fraction. She pulled out the chair beside him, and sat down and opened her county history to the wrong page, and closed it again. "Then you had better see my ledger," she said. She did not give it to him that afternoon. She gave it to him the following morning, in the same library, while Sophie was occupied with Mrs. Dora downstairs. She had lain awake most of the night, considering the question from every angle she could find. And the conclusion she kept arriving at was the same one. If Edmund Vane was what he said he was, her ledger was the record he needed. And if he was not, she had nothing left to lose that she valued more than her father's name. She set it on the table in front of him without preamble, and he opened it, and she watched him read. He read for some time. His face, in repose, was very still, but she had learned in 2 months to watch his hands instead, and his hands told her more. He turned pages carefully, with the same deliberate care with which her father had turned pages, and somewhere in the middle third he stopped and went back, and read a section twice, and the fingers of his right hand pressed flat against the page, in a gesture that was not quite a fist. "Your father caught it in 1816, he said. "He corrected it in the ledger," Clara said. "He did not confront Nathaniel directly. I think he was trying to gather enough evidence first." She paused. "He died before he could." Edmund's hand lifted from the page. He set it on the table beside the open ledger, palm down, and looked at it for a moment, and she understood without being told that he was thinking about his own father, the old lord who had died trusting the wrong son, or who had died without knowing what he was leaving behind. She would learn his wound in pieces over the days that followed, the way one learns the shape of a house in fog. Not all at once, but incrementally, as the light shifts. He told her on a cold afternoon when they were walking the grounds with Sophie between them, that he had left England 3 years ago believing his father had changed his will freely, that the old lord had simply decided in the end that Nathaniel was the safer steward of Tiverton's future. He had believed it because the alternative had seemed worse. It had seemed impossible that his father could have been deceived at the last, when he had been so clear all his life, so direct. Edmund had gone to India, then Italy, then nothing in particular, in the manner of a man who has been given no direction and cannot manufacture one. The letter from Mr. Josiah Clement had reached him in Florence 8 months ago. Clement had been the old lord's private solicitor, not the family solicitors who had handled the estate, but a single trusted man who had drawn up a document of private instruction. He was very old and he was dying, and he had written to Edmund with the particular urgency of a man who has held a secret too long and cannot carry it out of the world with him. He had a copy of the original will, Edmund said. He was looking at the valley below them, the long, gray fields in the November light. Sophie was running ahead toward the stone wall that marked the edge of the kitchen garden, her fair hair loose in the cold air. And a letter from my father, written in the month before he died, describing what he intended to leave to each of us. Tiverton was to be held jointly with Nathaniel, managing the estate and myself holding the entail in trust. The codicil removing me entirely was added after my father lost the use of his hands. Clement believes Nathaniel guided the pen. The cold settled around them. A crow passed over the wall where Sophie was sitting, and she held up her hand to it with perfect gravity, and it ignored her. "Why did Clement wait so long?" Clara asked. "Because he was afraid," Edmund said simply. "And because he was old, and he thought, as old men do sometimes, that things would resolve themselves without requiring him to act." He paused. They did not resolve themselves. She thought about her father. About the £430 and the letter written on Nathaniel's stationery, and the careful, regretful way Nathaniel had expressed his sorrow while removing her father's name from the estate records entirely. "Sophie!" she called, and Sophie jumped down from the wall and came back to them at a run. Lady Vane cornered Clara in the passage outside the morning room on a Thursday in the second week of November, which was unusual because Cecily did not generally find Clara's company necessary or interesting. She was a handsome woman with very good posture and the particular kind of composure that does not extend to situations she has not anticipated. "The tutor," she said without preamble. She held her fan in both hands, horizontal, a posture Clara had come to recognize as meaning she had made a decision and was announcing it, rather than consulting. "He asks too many questions." "He asks Sophie questions," Clara said carefully. "That is generally considered a virtue in a tutor." "He asks questions about the grounds," Cecily said. "About the leases, about the home wood. He asked Cook whether the old pump had always been at the north end of the stable yard, or whether it had been moved." She paused, looking at Clara with an expression that Clara could not entirely read. "I should not concern yourself with it. He is simply the hired man, and hired men are managed by Nathaniel." She said it with perfect certainty, the certainty of a woman who has never been asked to manage uncertainty herself. And Clara said yes, of course, and went upstairs to the schoolroom with her heart beating somewhat faster than the conversation had required. The days that followed were careful ones. Edmund had written to Mr. Clement, whose letter had already set the old solicitor in motion toward Shropshire. They did not discuss it in the house, not where they might be overheard. They discussed Sophie's French and the probable date of the first hard frost, and whether the county history's account of the siege of Shrewsbury was reliable. What they did not discuss, they conveyed in the particular vocabulary of people who are learning to read each other's pauses. He brought her a volume from the library one afternoon, a collection of botanical prints that had been her father's, inscribed in the old lord's hand, and he set it on the schoolroom table without comment. She opened it to the inscription. The old lord had written her father's name in the particular slanted hand she had known all her life, and beneath it, with thanks for 20 years of faithful service to Tiverton and its people. She closed the book and held it against her chest for a moment. And when she looked up, Edmund was no longer in the room, which she was grateful for. There were evenings in the library, late, when Sophie was in bed and the house had settled. He was almost always there when she came down on those evenings, which she told herself was not a pattern she was cultivating and which she cultivated anyway. They read sometimes, or she worked on Sophie's lesson plans while he worked on his notes for Clement. Occasionally one of them spoke, and occasionally the other answered, and the fire said the rest of it. She noticed the temperature of the air when he moved through it. She noticed that her own breathing changed. When he sat down beside her, some involuntary adjustment in the rhythm of it, like a bird that shifts its weight on a branch without meaning to fly. She noticed that he had the same habit her father had had of marking his place in a book with whatever was nearest to hand. A pen, a folded piece of paper, once a sprig of dried rosemary from the kitchen arrangement. And that this habit, small and domestic and utterly without significance, made something in her chest tighten painfully. She did not examine what that tightening meant. She was a practical woman in an impractical situation, and she had enough to manage. It was at dinner one evening, when a neighbor named Mr. Ashford had joined the table with his wife, that the familiar note was struck again. Mr. Recca, Mr. Scher. Ashford was a ruddy, cheerful man who owned the next estate and had known Nathaniel Vane since school. He had the habit of speaking across and around people without quite seeing them. He addressed himself to Nathaniel through most of the meal, and somewhere in the dessert, he made a passing reference to the timber sales on the south edge of the home wood, and Edmund said, quite quietly, that he had understood from the county records that those trees were old growth and protected under the original estate charter. The table went briefly. Still Mr. Ashford looked at Edmund with the slight surprise of a man who has heard an item of furniture speak. "Oh, you needn't worry about the timber," he said amiably. "This is a household matter." "Well?" "Crane is only the hired man." He waved a comfortable hand. "These decisions are his lordship's concern." Edmund's face did not change. His hands below the table were very still. Nathaniel, at the head of the table, met Edmund's eyes for a long moment. Then he smiled, the smooth public smile that sat on his face with such apparent ease. "Indeed," he said, "tutors are not generally consulted on estate management." "I take your point about the charter, Crane. I will look into it." He looked away. "More wine, Ashford?" Clara watched Edmund's profile. He lifted his glass. He drank. He said nothing further. She thought he was keeping his hand close. She thought Nathaniel had noticed the knowledge in him and will not rest until he knows where it came from. She was right on both counts. Nathaniel came to find her 2 days later, on a Saturday morning when Edmund was at his lessons with Sophie, and the house was quiet. He knocked at the door of her sitting room, with the courtesy he invariably maintained, even when what he was doing was not courteous. "I wanted to speak with you about Crane," he said, sitting down without being asked. He was a large man, florid and confident, dressed in his good dark green coat. "I've been thinking about his background. The agency's record is thin. Do you know anything about him that you have not told me?" Clara's hands were in her lap, very still. "He is excellent with Sophie," she said. "He is patient, and she has improved significantly in French." "I am not interested in his French," Nathaniel said. He was not a man who bothered with indirection when he had decided to proceed directly. "He knows this estate. He knows details about the grounds and the leases and the accounts that no man hired from a correspondence agency should know. Either someone has briefed him extensively, or he has a connection to Tiverton that he has not disclosed." He looked at her with the pale, close-set blue eyes she had always found difficult to meet. "I want to know which." "I can only tell you what I observe," Clara said. "He is thorough. Thorough men sometimes notice more than expected." Nathaniel looked at her for a long moment. "Yes," he said finally. "Well, I am sure you will tell me if anything comes to your attention." He stood smoothing his coat. "You have been very loyal to this household, Clara. I would not like to see that loyalty complicated." He left. Clara sat with her hands in her lap and listened to his footsteps descend the stairs, and counted slowly to 20, and then went to find Edmund. She found him at the window at the end of the schoolroom corridor. Sophie dismissed for a few minutes to fetch her grammar from the bedroom. She told him quickly and quietly what Nathaniel had said. He listened without interrupting. When she had finished, he was quiet for a moment, looking out at the frost-hardened grounds, the gray November sky above the line of beeches. At the end of the drive, Clement was to arrive by the 30th, he said. That is 12 days. Will Nathaniel wait 12 days? Edmund turned from the window. In the corridor's cold light, his face was very clear, and she could see the thing that lived beneath the watchfulness, the thing she had been seeing in pieces since the afternoon in the library. Not anger at what had been done to him, but grief for what had been done to these people, to this place. To the woman standing in front of him whose father's name was still written in a stranger's hand, in a ledger that called him a thief. I do not know, he said honestly, Clara. He said her name in the particular way he had said it once before, in the library, accidentally, and then not corrected. Whatever Nathaniel does or says about you, about your father, about your position here, I need you to know that I will not leave this house without setting the record straight on those accounts. She looked at him steadily. It was harder than it should have been. You have your own restitution to seek, she said. Do not make promises about mine on top of it. They are the same promise, he said. They were from the beginning. If you're still with this story as we come toward the turn of it, you know by now what kind of man Edmund is, the kind that has been lost for 3 years, and has not used the time to cultivate resentment. You may leave a word in the space below this story when it is done, if you care to say what moved you most. Now return with me to the house. Nathaniel moved faster than 12 days. A fortnight before Christmas, a lawyer named Pendrell arrived from Shrewsbury. Not Mr. Clement, but another man, younger, with Nathaniel's manner about him, a hired efficiency. He arrived on a Tuesday evening and was closeted with Nathaniel until late. Clara heard the voices through the wall of the passage, not the words, but the register of them, and she knew from the register that it was over. In the morning, Nathaniel came to the schoolroom. He came alone, which was unlike him. He usually moved through the house with at least the implicit company of his own authority. He closed the door. Sophie was not in the room, being downstairs with Mrs. Dorrit, and Clara was at the table correcting translations, and Edmund was standing at the window with his hands at his sides. Nathaniel looked at Edmund for a long time. Then, he said simply, with one word, Edmund. The word dropped into the room like a stone into still water. Nathaniel, Edmund said. His voice was level. His hands did not move. You have been in this house for 6 weeks. Under a false name, using a position of trust to examine my accounts and documents, he said this, in the tone of a man assembling a case, calm and procedural, and it was the calmness that was the threat in it. That is fraud. That is criminal trespass. Mr. Pendrell is prepared to pursue both charges. Mr. Pendrell may do as he sees fit, Edmund said. And Miss Pemberton, Nathaniel said, turning to look at her with the particular smooth precision of a man who has saved the most effective instrument for last. Who has, I think, known for some weeks who her colleague is, and has chosen not to inform me. That is a kind of conspiracy, Clara. A small one, perhaps, no more enough. Clara put down her pen. She did so carefully without haste, aligning it with the edge of the paper. She was aware of her own heartbeat in a way she was not always aware of it. Not panic, but the heightened attention of a woman who has arrived at a moment she cannot afford to mishandle. I owe you my loyalty, she said, to Sophie. I have always been loyal to Sophie. Sophie is not the question, Nathaniel said. Then I am afraid, Clara said quietly, that I cannot give you what you are asking for. My father worked faithfully for this estate for 19 years. And I have worked faithfully here for 3. If you wish to dismiss me, you may. I will not say anything false in order to stay. Nathaniel looked at her for a moment with something that might, in another man, have been respect. Then he looked at Edmund. "You have 7 days," he said, "to leave this property. If you are still here at the end of 7 days, I will have Mr. Pendrell in front of the magistrate before sunset." He left, pulling the door closed, with a quiet finality that was worse than a slam. Clara and Edmund did not speak for a moment. The fire in the schoolroom hearth had burned low, and the morning light lay cold on the table between them. "Clement," she said. "He was 3 days away when I last heard," Edmund said. "That was 4 days ago." She stood up from the table. She crossed the room to the window where he was standing, and looked out at the frozen grounds of the estate she had spent her adult life walking. And she thought about her father, who had kept the accounts with meticulous care for 19 years, and had been called a thief for it. And she thought about the man standing beside her who had come back from the other side of Europe on the word of a dying solicitor, and she thought, "Enough. Then we send for him," she said, "today. And we request that he come before the quarter-day dinner, where every tenant on this estate will be assembled." Edmund looked at her. Something in his face shifted in the way she had learned to watch. For that small relaxation of the discipline, he kept clamped down over everything. "That is not a cautious plan," he said. "No," Clara agreed. "It is not." The quarter-day dinner was held on the 18th of December by tradition in the great dining hall of Tiverton, and it was the one occasion in the year when the full weight of the estate's social world was assembled in a single room. Tenants and neighboring gentry, the household staff seated at the lower tables, the procedural apparatus of half a century of vain hospitality, spread across candle-lit linen, and it was exactly the room Nathaniel had fashioned his authority in, the room where the old lord's son had received the loyalty of his people and their rent money, the room where the hierarchy of Tiverton was most completely itself. Mr. Clement arrived from Shrewsbury on the afternoon of the 17th, a small and very old man in a brown coat, carrying a leather case that he held against his side with both arms, as though it were a child. Clara met him at the side entrance as Edmund had arranged. She took him up to the library, where Edmund was waiting, and she stood by the window while the two men spoke in low voices for a long time. The case opened on the table between them, the documents laid out with great care. She did not look at the documents. She already knew what they said. That evening, at dinner, Nathaniel was at his most assured. He had the expansive confidence of a man who believes. The threat has been managed, and he moved through the room with the comfortable authority of ownership, his pale eyes at their most settled. Cecily was beside him, composed and lovely. Mr. Ashford was at the table again with several other neighboring families. The tenants were at the lower end. Edmund sat where he had sat for 6 weeks at the far end of the table, quiet and watchful. Clara sat near the middle. She did not look at him often. The soup was served, and the fish, and the second course arrived, and was cleared, and the candles burned down an inch, and then Edmund rose. He rose without haste, in the manner of a man who has decided on something and is not hurrying toward it. He set the ring on the cloth in front of him. The plain gold signet, the hawk, above the broken chain, the crest of the Vane family that every person in that room would recognize. Then he looked up, and his eyes moved along the table until they found Clara's, and the expression on his face was what it was. "My name is Edmund," he said into the silence that had spread outward from the ring the way cold spreads from a window. "I am the younger son of the old Lord of Tiverton. This ring belonged to my father. He gave it to me in the month before he died, privately, along with a letter that I have asked Mr. Clement of Shrewsbury to read in your presence tonight." Nathaniel had risen. He was very still, the florid color of his face gone peculiar, and his hands were at his sides. "Whatever you imagine yourself to be," Nathaniel said, and his voice was steady, admirably steady, controlled by the same discipline that had built the fiction of the codicil and maintained it for 3 years. "You are the hired man in this house. Whatever documents you have produced, they are the fraudulent instruments of a man who has been practicing deception under my roof, and they will not stand." Mr. Clement had opened his case. What unfolded in the next hour was procedural, which is to say it was thorough and irrevocable, and left no comfortable middle ground for anyone who had built their certainty on the codicil's terms. The old solicitor read the documents in his thin, clear voice, unhurried, while the room held its breath and the candles burned. He read the original will. He read the private letter from the old lord, dated 3 months before his death, describing his intentions for the estate in terms that admitted no ambiguity about the division he had planned. He produced the evidence of the codicil's forgery, which was technical and specific and would be examined by 2 independent lawyers before the month was out. He noted in passing that the £430 recorded as shortfall in the estate accounts of 1815 had been introduced in a hand consistent with the then heir's own, and that the correction to those entries, made in a different hand consistent with that of the late steward, her father, had been concealed by the removal of the relevant pages from the primary ledger. Clara held very still through this part. She held very still, and felt something that had been stone-heavy in her chest for 3 years. Slowly, incrementally shift. Cecily's hand had stopped moving midway through the reading. The fan lay on the table in front of her. Forgotten. Nathaniel spoke once more, when Clement had finished. He spoke to Edmund across the length of the table, and his voice was no longer steady. "You have no right," he said. Edmund looked at him for a moment. Just looked, the way he had looked at the accounts in the library, measuring the thing against what he knew. Then he turned. He walked the length of the table to where Clara was seated. He did not hurry. The room watched him come, and Clara watched him come, and her hands were flat on the tablecloth, and she did not move them. He stopped beside her chair. He looked at her for a moment, and she looked at him, and everything they had not said in the library in the evenings and on the cold grounds in the afternoons, with Sophie running ahead of them, was present in that particular few seconds. "Miss Pemberton is under my protection," he said. His voice was quiet and entirely level. "She always has been." The room was very still. Nathaniel sat down. It was not a choice, precisely. It was what happened when the mechanism that had been holding him upright for 3 years was suddenly not there. Cecily put her hand over his, a gesture so automatic she perhaps did not know she was making it, and Clara held the recognition quietly. She had not known. She was simply the woman who married him, and she did not know. Sophie, who should not have been at the dinner at all, and who had crept into the servants' entrance and had been sitting behind Mrs. Dorrit for the last 20 minutes, made a small sound. Clara turned and found her, and Sophie came to her with her arms out, and Clara held her. There is a great deal that comes after a thing like that, and it is mostly procedural, the work of lawyers, documents, sworn statements, the quiet and complete work of undoing a lie that has had 3 years to put down roots. It took until the end of January before the formal transfer of the entail was confirmed. It took another month for the estate accounts to be re-examined by the independent lawyers and her father's name to be formally cleared, which was done in writing, and the letter was given to Clara, and she put it inside the botanical book with the old lord's inscription. Tiverton in February was spare and clear. The last of the snow melted from the south-facing slopes, and the homewood showing the first faint signs of something returning. Nathaniel had removed himself to the Harbrook family's estate in Norfolk, where Cecily's father would presumably manage his son-in-law's chastened dignity with more patience than it deserved. The staff were unchanged. Sophie was unchanged, which was the thing that mattered. Mrs. Dorrit had taken on a new dignity as the woman who had quietly seen the whole thing coming and said nothing, because she had learned that some things must be allowed to resolve at their own pace. Clara was in the library on a Thursday afternoon in the 3rd week of February, working at the central table with the corrected accounts spread before her, when Edmund came in with 2 cups of tea and set one in front of her. He sat down in the chair beside her. The afternoon light lay across the old volumes on the shelves and across the tabletop and across his hands, which were folded, quiet, in the manner of a man who is in no hurry. "The South Meadow lease," he said. "I have been looking at the rates." "They are low," Clara said. "They have been low for 3 years. The tenants adjusted their plans accordingly. I want to bring them up gradually, not all at once. He looked at her. What does your father's ledger suggest was the appropriate rate in 1815? She turned to the relevant page. She told him. He made a note. They worked for a time in the quiet of the library, the fire behind them saying what fires say on winter afternoons. Somewhere in the house, Sophie was at the pianoforte. The same passage she had been practicing in October, finally resolved, running cleanly now through all its repetitions. At some point, Clara became aware that Edmund was not looking at the accounts. She looked up from the page. He was looking at her with the expression she had seen briefly at the dinner table, and in the schoolroom corridor, and on the grounds in November, that expression of a man who has been carrying a thing a very long way and has set it down, and in the setting down has become aware of something that was behind it. There is something I have not said, he said. You have said very little in general, she observed. It is a habit I have noted. Something moved in his face that was almost the thing she had never once seen there, the thing she had come to believe might belong to him the way summer lightning belongs to a sky that has been overcast for months. Clara, he said. He said her name with the particular deliberateness he always used when he was saying something that cost him effort to say plainly. I came back to Tiverton to set a wrong thing right. I found, in this house, a woman who was already engaged in setting it right, without any of the evidence I carried, without any guarantee that she would be believed, without any support, except her own knowledge of what was true. I found her doing this, while caring for a child who needed her, and managing a household that did not value her adequately. And I found myself wanting, from approximately the third week of my residence in this house, not merely to restore what was taken from her, but to be someone who stays. Clara had gone very still. The accounts were open in front of her. You are the son of the house, she said. Her voice was careful. Your position is entirely restored. You do not need to offer me anything as a form of gratitude. I am not offering you anything as a form of gratitude, he said, with the precise economy that was his native idiom when he was most serious. I am telling you what I want. I want, if you will permit it, to learn over a long time what it means to be the person you have chosen to allow into your confidence. I want to learn it slowly, and without the particular inconvenience of one of us being in disguise. He paused. I have been told I am occasionally difficult to read. Only occasionally, Clara said. He reached across the table and set his hand over hers on the open page of the account book. His hand was warm, and the weight of it was the weight of something that had been long deferred, and was now simply present. Will you stay at Tiverton? He said, not as Sophie's companion, not as anyone's employee. Clara looked at his hand on hers. She looked at the shelves her father had known, at the window she had crossed to in November when she had told Edmund it was not a cautious plan. She thought about the letter in the botanical book, and the old lord's inscription, and the particular quality of the light in this room on winter afternoons, which she had known since she was 4 years old and had never quite been able to leave. Yes, she said, I will stay. He lifted her hand from the page and held it, and said nothing further because there was nothing further to say that the fire was not already saying, and the afternoon was not already saying, and the sound of Sophie's scales from across the house was not already saying with perfect, patient clarity. On the desk between them, the signet ring lay where Edmund had set it the night before. The gold worn smooth at the shank, the hawk, in flight above the broken chain, catching the last of the winter light. It had found its way home. If Clara's story moved you, if you have felt what it is to have your father's name restored, or to stand in a room that finally knows who you are, leave a word in the space below this one. And thank you, quietly and sincerely, for staying until the end.